Hello. Can you hear me? A little. I think that was not in reference to me. Am I? You hear me okay? Okay, cool. I'm going to turn it up just in case. To soothe the writer's egos, you know? Am I loud enough? All right. Thanks for coming to Loose Lips. We're doing things a little different tonight. Normally, we have a different guest host, and they choose 4 writers to read something from the last 30 days of news. But also, we like to use it as a platform to do whatever the hell we want. And in this case, we've got a couple of lovely writers, one of them from Orlando, one of them visiting from Jacksonville, who have new books out, and we want to celebrate them. I believe half of the duo has followed the prompt. I guess they were good students. That half does have several degrees, so maybe it's like he still thinks he's in a degree program and it was homework. But anyway, yeah, and I'm going to tell you more about their books. If you want to know a little bit more about Burrow Press, we have cultish-looking bookmarks, an email list, and a postcard for our next book that's coming out in April. There'll be an event for that in May. But that's enough about that. That's over there. Our first reader tonight is C.H. Hooks. He's the author of this book, Alligator Zoo Park Magic. He writes and lives with his family in Brunswick, Georgia. Oh, you're not from Jacksonville anymore. He's always from Jacksonville in my heart. He received an MFA from the University of Tampa and is a lecturer at the College of Coastal Georgia. Alligator Zoo Park Magic, which you can purchase right there and get a sticker, is his debut novel. Please welcome C.H. Hooks.
Thank you, Ryan. Hey, that's me. Thanks to Ryan and, of course, to John for having me out tonight, letting me kind of jump on John's dance card. Kind of been all over the place over the past few weeks, and we're slowly moving back toward home at this point. Excuse me, that's the cough I've developed while I've been on the road too. That's really neat. So, like Ryan said, this is my novel, Alligator Zoo Park Magic. It came out about 3 weeks ago, and in anticipation of that, there's been this. I've really been avoiding the whole Florida man thing throughout this because I certainly didn't write it with that going through my mind. But this afternoon, Elizabeth and I were sitting there at a park over in Winter Park. We had just been to the bookstore over there. I think it's called Writer's Block. And while we were over there, the 2 people that were working there decided that they were going to have an impromptu sci-fi book club. And I was in the fiction room looking at books, and they actually went in there and started shuffling chairs and tables around and kind of moved us out of the room. And we're like, Elizabeth and I, we actually went to the front door and started checking their hours and like flipped their sign around to close. And we went outside and we were like, wait, they're not closed yet. So we went back and flipped their sign back around to open and just left because we realized that they were busy. So then I went to a park over there. Anyway, this is a really long diatribe. We sat down on a bench and it's like, I'm finally going to do this. I'm going to check my birth date with Florida Man because this has been this thing that's been cruising around the internet. And sure enough, November 4th is my birthday, just in case any of you are looking to contribute next year. But I found online that for my birthday, the special thing that happened in Florida with apparently a man was that a man dressed as Fred Flintstone was pulled over for driving drunk. And so he was actually, Florida man dressed as Fred Flintstone is pulled over for going too fast, which is just impossible, I would think. Oh, sorry, I'm getting away from the mic. Thanks, John. So, anyway, I've avoided it this far, and now I think I'm exhausted and headed home. Here, I'm going to actually take it off the stand for a second. Yeah. I tend to do a little bit better like this. Now I can be mobile. The threat is real now. All right. So enough of my jabbering. I'm going to go on and read to you from the book. And I'm going to start from the start. I'm going to start with chapter 1 because none of you have read the book. Except for Bo. Thank you, Bo, who has read the book. Bo, my cousin. So I am going to start from chapter 1, and I'm going to read probably maybe like 6 chapters. I think that's about how far I'll get. Yeah. That'll take us to John. Who's going to read his entire book tonight. So, all right. Here we go. No, not yet. Here we go, properly. Jeffers was looking like a ghost hanging upside down from that big old oak tree, the one we used to swing from out into the spring's cool waters. That tree was there probably a few hundred years, not thinking it would ever be used for magic. But there was Jeffers, his nice guy eyes plugged deep, a sleight of spirit, and a head full of hurt. He took in a lifetime of everybody's bad and made good. He hung by his ankles, all slithered up in rope coils, a bunny wrapped up in a snake. I don't get the trick, some city boy was saying, still looking down to make sure they'd followed the right directions out into our woods and far out of feeling comfortable. I don't know that anybody there was knowing what to make of Jeffers in the trees, rope creaking, hanging by his feet in the orangey pink twilight. People were swatting at their bodies and listening to the crickets and the frogs get their songs started. That little sliver of a moon was peeking through the trees, winking at everybody like it was in on the joke. There were probably about a few hundred people out in the woods. Road leading there was lined with trucks, vans, and big tired trans, and folks were still walking up the road. They brought their beach chairs and picnic blankets. There sure wasn't enough space. So they just stood around, eating buckets of chicken and drinking out of rolling coolers. I cut my nerves with some smoke and hustled through my first couple of beers. Jeffers cut me out. He cut his lady Miriam too. We tried asking separate. We tried asking together, but he just shook us off. I don't think he had a real reason other than the need to be alone. He wanted to go solo into the danger of this one. Miriam told me. The only people close to him he blocked out. Instead, he got Judd. Didn't say why, wouldn't even talk about it, but it pissed me off plenty. Miriam tried to apologize for Jeffers, but didn't even know what to say about it. She didn't know a reason, just knew I was hurt. I stared over at Judd for a minute, and he felt me looking, kept examining the rope in his hand, looking guilty and a little sheepish. I wanted to punch him in the lip, give him something to wipe on his shirt sleeve, to remember me by when I left for good. Jeffers and me hadn't seen each other in over a week. It was the longest ever that I hadn't seen him since he ran off when we were just kids. He'd been coming out here practicing for this trick. Wouldn't tell me where he was going when I called. I should have known when I told Miriam I was going swimming and she asked me to go pick her up some beer instead. She knew I'd do it if she was buying, that I'd end up with some for myself. She never even drank beer. Tricky. I looked up at the moon again. It wouldn't even shine enough light to let us see the trick. Don't know why we had to have the trick at the last of the light, but it was all on purpose. Jeffers didn't do these things for no reason. One deer light off Judd's truck was pointed straight at Jeffers. Nothing else. It was still too warm for lightning bugs. Some little hustler was walking around selling baggies like they were popcorn. Shrooms? Made me mad at first, then I bought some, pure out of hunger. Wasn't no need to get bent, things were weird enough. Even still, I popped a couple just to have something to chew on. Folks were always looking to make a buck. I was wondering if Jeffers was getting a cut when Judd started in. Thanks for coming out, everybody. Judd was tall, hunched and hairy, all loose jaws and tall gums. His sleeves were wet, maybe from wiping his mouth, and his shadow looked like it might lurk around in some kid's bad dream. Ladies and gentlemen, Jeffers the Magnificent. Asshole waved his arm like a showgirl, then tried real hard to get that deer spot right on Jeffers. Jeffers looked wild and spooky, like he hadn't slept in a while. Tonight, I'm going to do the biggest trick you ever seen done yet. He didn't look himself. Maybe it was all the blood rushing to his head. Some folks started crowding in. I did too. These are some handcuffs from the sheriff. Jeffers pointed down to Sheriff Chuck. He was eating out of one of them baggies, taking a nice pinch in his fingers when Judd shined that spot on him. He looked up and smiled and finished the bite while he bobbed his head. Then he gave a thumbs up. Judd shined the light back on Jeffers. "There's a whole bundle of gators down there." Jeffers motioned below. "They might be hungry." Judd moved, pointed the light down on the spring. Sure enough, there was a cluster of little shiny eyes. The light went back on Jeffers. He got to tightening up the handcuffs and held his wrists out to the crowd. The handcuffs were real shiny, looked like Miriam might have put some glitter paint on them. He showed us the keys to the cuffs, then dropped them in the water. My buddy Tommy snuck up and nudged me. He whispered, "This shit for real?" "I don't know." I was happy to start feeling the mushrooms, knew I was answering honestly. "Thought you always did." Tommy was surprised. I was a little too. "Always did before, you just ain't talking." "Nope. Not in on this one." I pointed over at Judd with my thumb like I was hitching his new assistant. "Huh." Tommy looked over there, his mouth hanging open and wheezing a mix of breath and whiskey. "Weird." Pete walked up, and his brother Andy wasn't far behind, rolling over another cooler. I was kind of relieved to see them, but there was definitely somebody missing. Miriam stayed home. Said she didn't want to see this one. Judd hit a button on the tape deck, and some techno circus music started pumping out in the crowd. City boys were laughing, folks weren't taking it seriously, and I felt a little embarrassed for Jeffers. It took him a lot of years to get here. I was a little embarrassed for myself, too. I heard another familiar voice, but it wasn't human. It wasn't no everyday gator. It sounded like a Cummins diesel wrapped up in gator skin. That bellowing was shaking water and rumbling, and I knew then things weren't right. Lazarus was out there in the water. Didn't know how he got there, but he was hungry for sure. I swear Jeffers looked down at me, nodded. When he did, that rope started getting longer. It slipped out faster, and folks started freaking a little. I did too. Judd kept on giving him slack and lowering him down, even when people started yelling, "Stop!" Shadows of all the little gator logs crossed the water, and I saw something big walking over top all those little gators just like it was walking on water. Lazarus was as big as a gator came and could jump out of the water about the same as he was long. Son of a bitch looked like a dog going after a frisbee when he went to meet Jeffers at the end of that rope. Jeffers gave out one last big moan, and Lazarus gave out about the same. They flopped in the water with who on top of who and splashed up a fountain back toward the trees. White cloth flattened on the top of the water like a blanket. Then it made a sad, sucking noise when it all got yanked under. For a second, it seemed funny. Then the whole world twirled around like smoke. The sun gave out its last little bit of light and quit for the moon to take over for keeps. It didn't even get to set. A cloud covered it up and helped it slink away in secret. Jeffers had never bullshitted me. He told me this one was going bad for sure. That thought didn't bring any comfort, just made me feel queasy. I ran over toward the water. "Judd, shine the light!" Judd looked as sick and surprised as any, had this real blank face and got startled when I talked at him. He fumbled with the light and pointed it down at the water. All I saw was splashing and a bundle of little gators rearranging after all the excitement, and a stream of bubbles. It could have been the spring welling up, or it could have been Jeffers' last breath. I kneeled down on the bank and got the knees of my pants good and muddy, trying to digest what I just saw. If Jeffers just got snatched up, there was a small chance he could make it back to the top. If he got the handcuffs off. If he could find which way was up. If he was still in one piece. If Lazarus decided to let him go. The deer light went out. "Judd, keep the light over here." I turned around and saw taillights where the spotlight had been. Judd was driving off. "Pete, get Chuck!" But Sheriff Chuck was leaving too. Nobody wanted to wait around to be a witness. People were scrambling out into the woods, trying to get to their cars before the lines of traffic backed up. Everybody wanted to see Jeffers' big trick, but not a soul wanted to be a part of the fallout. Me and Tommy and Pete and Andy split up on both sides of the bank and started walking downstream. We swatted bushes with sticks, shooing moccasins and small gators, knowing that if we came across Lazarus, he'd probably be sleeping after such a meal. I found a boot, but it wasn't Jeffers. Pete found nothing, and Andy found a car battery. There was no doubting that Lazarus could have dragged Jeffers down in the caverns, no problem. A body could get hung up in there and never come out. But Lazarus would have to come up for air. Lazarus would have been a little more difficult to hide. I fully expected to have to cut him open and find pieces of Jeffers in his belly. Maybe his eyes would still be open. Maybe he'd gasp out a last word, tell me what went wrong. I heard Lazarus before I ever came up on him, letting loose some big gator groans like he would when he got an upset stomach, or kind of like Denny, my ex, when she was all knocked up. But this noise was a little different. I started thinking that maybe it wasn't Lazarus. But then I knew for sure when the moon lit up its markings and reflected off those eyes, they were pointed right at me, maybe 20 feet away and looking sad as could be. You sorry for what you've done? I started gurgling as soon as I started talking, probably sounding like I was drowning from all of my snot and tears. Lazarus let out another one of those big guttural groans, then a snort. Why'd you go on and gobble up Jeffers? I picked up a stick, like that was somehow going to protect my ass from a gator of that size. Lazarus could have snapped an arm like a Slim Jim. That thought got me all choked up again, thinking about my best friend down on his belly, so I threw the stick at him, but he moved his head a little. The stick would have missed anyway, but Lazarus was just making me feel silly, showing me how he could move like that, out of the way quick like that. How'd you get your ass out here? I waited around on an answer, and he just groaned all mournful. Lazarus was supposed to be pinned up at the Alligator Zoo Park. He was the big attraction, the biggest gator for counties, maybe in the state. There was some rustling in the brush coming up behind me. Could have been a bear or some kind of big cat, but for sure it was just Tommy. I shushed him, shh, and pointed over to the clearing where Lazarus was camped. All I saw by the time I turned my head around was the tip of that big old tail scooting off into the woods fast as could be. Seconds. 2 seconds, and he was gone. His trail of burps smelled like Jeffers, and I swear I could see them in color. We chased him and lost him, then stayed out there all night, ate more mushrooms, and drank more beer than a body could handle. I cried like a baby, and Pete roughed me up, trying to get me to come to. Andy disappeared for a while, and we looked for him. Found him up a tree, straddling a branch and talking to a bobcat about what happened. I think that's what went on. It all ended up kind of fuzzy, but we didn't find another piece of Jeffers or Lazarus. It gave me a little bit of hope in the worst way. I don't know when Tommy gave up and left. Once he saw Lazarus, he'd had enough to make up his mind about Jeffers' chances. Pete had to drag me and Andy out of there. I know that for a fact. I had every notion to stay and wait for Lazarus. I'd live out there if need be. Instead, Pete gave me a ride back to my house, where I ate a box of Hot Pockets and called Miriam. She didn't pick up. Instead, she knocked on my door. He gone? Her mouth was already purple with Carlo Rossi. She hadn't slept either, maybe not in days. I started bawling out my eyes and spitting a lot while I chewed my last Hot Pocket. I wasn't even hungry, but I snapped my teeth together and blew out the hot from the back of my throat. I tried to tell Miriam what happened, but just ended up honking and heaving a lot. I was a goddamn human puddle. It was all over. I told her there was nothing, that my friend was gone in the worst way, that I couldn't even say goodbye to some dead and gone, lifeless, cold body all swolled up with water because I'd failed him in that too. I couldn't find him. Then I told Miriam what Jeffers told me. I'll be back on day 3.
One more brief and frightening round of applause for CH. You know, there's a way to hold a book, and then there's the CH Hooks way to hold a book. And I think I'm going to start a trend. I think you've started a trend. I'm going to start. Thank you. Get the book, and get this book from our next reader, John King. John King is the host of the world's greatest creative writing podcast, The Drunken Odyssey, as featured on Best of Lists by Book Riot and The Millions. He holds an MFA in fiction writing from New York University, a doctorate in English from Purdue University. His work appears in the anthologies 15 Views of Orlando, Other Orlandos, and Condoms and Hot Tubs Don't Mix, which is also over there, from Beating Windward Press, who is also over there, as well as journals such as Gargoyle, The Newer York, and Painted Bride Quarterly. He lives in a secret location in the lesser Orlando area with his wife, Kat, and a cadre of Robot Duplicates. He is the author. What do you call it when you're the author of a book that's not technically out yet? He is the pre-author of the pre-book, which you can still now get, Guy Psycho and the Ziggurat of Shame. Please welcome John King.
Yeah, I think we are fucking with the time-space continuum, but I approve of that, so. Thank you all for being here. How y'all doing? Really? You're that worn out? So, CH, thank you. I'm really honored we could be a part of your book tour, so it's really great to have you here. So, Loose Lips usually is about current events. So this piece is called When Joe Biden Kissed Me. No, I didn't. Sorry. Unfortunately, I don't have anything smart to say about the Mueller report other than maybe we should see it before we decide it's over. So I just got back from AWP's conference, and so I'm recording this for my podcast. I forgot if I mentioned that or not, but so here's my report on AWP, and then I'll talk about Mr. Psycho and my troubled relationship with him. He doesn't like it when I talk about him. All right, so this is called 12,000 Riders Plus Add Their Neuroses to Portland. I'm less than 72 hours removed from the 2019 installment of the AWP conference. One of my podcast listeners wrote me to ask if AWP was worth attending for someone without an MFA, and I said probably not unless you could do so without having to pay a lot for travel. It's kind of like Walt Disney World without any rides. It's kind of like a comic book convention with really shitty cosplay. For the uninitiated, AWP is crowded with people who know so many other MFA writers. The book fair part of the convention is agoraphobic. We are an ant colony teeming with words, creating a babble that can make one feel trapped undersea. The initiated tend to complain about the experience, which is often a way of deflecting how privileged one can be to have such an experience. I myself feel quite privileged to be there. The Drunken Odyssey shared a table with Black Fox Literary Magazine, and basically, I never worked that booth except for one really long 20-minute stint. Bless you, Raquel and Megan, for telling people about my thing while I was grabbing interviews outside the fair. So I snagged a table in an alcove by the escalators and interviewed 3 generations of writers, Erica Jong, Campbell McGrath, and Elisa Gabbard. Campbell and I know each other. He let me interview him in his backyard 2 years ago. I think he still regrets it. But this was my first time meeting Erica Jong and Eliza Gabbard. As Eric and I walked from the far side of the convention back to my auxiliary secret headquarters for the podcast, we got onto the subject of Henry Miller, who she was friends with, and we seemed to recognize the aesthetic wavelengths we shared. I met Elisa underneath this 2-story pendulum that swung its way over the heads of the writers. And whenever I see something like that, I'm like, fall, fall, fall. I don't want it to fall, but I want it to fall. So our interview felt like a fun essay about essays. So that night I attended Copper Canyon's poetry reading in the main ballroom and recorded Deborah Lando, Jericho Brown, Ellen Bass, and Javier Zamora. The poets appeared on a Jumbotron-sized screen as they read to a room of about 100 participants. The verse was exquisitely good, and I don't know, I felt it really comforting to see giant heads of poets reading their poem like it was a sporting event. It was, you know, like, I think poets deserve that, don't you? Miraculously, the next morning, my panel on life balance, which I know fuck nothing about, was accepted. So Jamie Passant, Rayan Amilcar Scott, Chelsea Clammer, and I spoke about how to keep energized through exhaustion and sustain this unsustainable writing life. Then my friend Todd James Pierce, who's a fiction writer and the greatest Disney historian ever, we jaunted over to the Alibi, a tiki bar established in 1947. It was so delightfully dark in there, and I had a Mai Tai and some bizarre brunch concoction of hamburger, gravy, rice, and an egg. It made me woozy in the best possible way. So back at my hotel, I walked to an odd building about a mile and a half from the fair with my recording shit to meet up with third man publisher Chet Wisey at the No Fair Fair, an offsite AWP convention fair. Like it was, they basically had their alternative to AWP. And they were going to have a massive poetry reading later that night. To get there, I had to walk from the corporate area of the Convo Center and ended up passing what I think might be the real Portland. So I had to walk over a highway and saw gardening and yoga happening in unusual places. The No Fair Fair was held in a bright windowed industrial communal workspace. It looked like an art gallery. A DJ was spinning the Pina Colada song when I walked in, so that felt pretty good. So I needed to recuperate. That walk with all my gear wore me down, but I had a really great conversation with Chet that's going to appear later on the podcast. After that, I walked back to my hotel and then spent 20 minutes in the NYU mixer before heading out for something to drink and eat. So the next day, Jamie Passant and I toured Powell's, a heavenly hive of words where I would love to live. They need beds there, I think. I met Brian Turner there for the third or fourth time during this conference. He and I had been having like many conversations all throughout the fair. I kept myself from buying Tintin comics, although I did buy Toni Morrison's new book as a present for my wife. Though if you guys want to buy me Tintin comic books, I totally. So I bunked with Brian Druckenmiller. Drunk? I'm adding an N there to make him drunk. Brendan Stevens and Jamie. And on the flight back, I sat next to Ryan Rivas as he edited a forthcoming book from Burrow Press as we flew across the country. My brain has skid marks on it. What this trip taught me is that I'm rich in friends, old and new. I get to have great conversation, and the Mai Tais at the Alibi are top notch. I also somehow wrote an essay and 2 poems in Portland, including a verse about my grandmother's penis. All right, so that's enough of that. True. If you've read my story in Condoms and Hot Tubs Don't Mix, yeah, it's not really that far of a stretch. So, no. And don't even try and read it that way. Sooner or later, everything's about my grandmother. So, yeah, this guy Psycho, I met him, I think, in a dream after I went to Las Vegas for spring break. That's the kind of asshole I am. Vegas, baby, for spring break. By the way, it's cold in Vegas in spring break, so it's not even like a normal Vegas trip. But, this name kept recurring to me, Guy Psycho. And after Vegas, there was this little diner off the strip. And it had a lounge in it, and it just seemed like off the beaten path enough to be kind of cool. And it was like a diner, like a normal diner, except it had a really cool lounge in it. That's Vegas. And it was like the scheme was black on black on black. And when I got home after that, I saw this rather strange gentleman staring at me in my mind, and that was Guy Psycho. And about a decade later, I wrote a book about him, and a decade later, it got published. So, partly your fault, partly my fault. Anyway, so I'm going to read a little bit from the beginning here. We're not going to meet Guy Psycho in this passage, but we're going to meet. What's that? Are we going to meet the Ziggurat? No.
Will we feel
Wait for it. Chapter 1, there is no equilibrium. What was it Andy Kaufman said? No, settle down, we have a very long way to go. An immense rectangle of pulsating chrome squiggled up the mountain. Tires splashed across runoff from the exposed terrain, the furs clinging for life to the weeping rocks. From the rear of the bus, 8 valves whooshed out nothing but the crispest, coolest oxygen into the piney air. Inside the bus, in a soundproof chamber, in an ergonomic, translucent blue seat, sat Archibald Fitzpatrick, CPA, the new manager of Guy Psycho and the Postmodern Heirs. He scratched his short, curly brown hair, leaned forward, his blue rep tie hanging at an angle. Damn, he thought. Along the wall, silent screens ran in an omniscient matrix. One screen foretold the weather from Georgia to Chicago to Cairo. Another scrolled with financial tickers from New York, London, and Tokyo. 2 different rugby scrims, sumo wrestling, several Busby Berkeley films, Fred Astaire's cheekbones immaculate and ghostly. And amongst the Art Deco kaleidoscope of BB's choreography was footage from the band in Las Vegas. The chorus girls high-kicking, the musicians thrashing, and Guy Psycho crooning into antiquarian chrome. Every single camera angle was laced with bubbles. The silent footage was spooky, glamorous, cool velvet and sequins. The harmonies of the Postmodern Heirs could sympathetically affect the vocal cords of anyone in a venue, or someone sitting by himself on a tour bus without the sound even being on. Archibald's email was choked with messages from liquor companies, fashion houses, perfumeries, and the Las Vegas Chamber of Commerce to sponsor this tour. The computers in front of his bloodshot blue eyes were constantly getting strange messages in several languages. The internet was intermittent, a stream of interruptions. His coffee tilted in his stainless steel mug. Hired 2 weeks ago in a job interview that resembled a decadent kidnapping, Archibald thought he could make a difference in managing their assets and their business. He wasn't a show business accountant, which was among his chief attractions, apparently. But Archibald was having doubts. They didn't have the credit to outlast the week. Their expenditures strained comprehension, champagne pyramids, gratuitous couture, no thrift whatsoever when it comes to food, and who's buying all of this sodium pentothal? And the weird venues were not helping. Why not a residency in Vegas? And why the hell not accept some of these sponsors, at least for the products they consume in such orgiastic quantities? The Sabre Room ought to have to wait. A surprise gig at the right clubs in Chicago or Nashville could take care of their banks for now. Archibald sounded cool, statuesque, the cut of his Colin McFeeny trousers making him feel sharp. He printed out a data summary. He slipped on his jacket, which felt like an unconscious extension of his skin, like a slight tingling. Opening the door may have been a mistake. 90 decibels. Shimmering bubbles levitated thither and hither amidst the strobes of heavenly disco light, while 12 divine chorus girls, the Postmodern Heirs, jitterbugged. The gloopy pulsations of sound conformed to the undulations of the great bus. The angelic sway of bow-waisted cocktail dresses of scarlet satin and feminine flesh transfigured the fluttery air into a shadowy bacchanal of light. There was a manic vamping of Mary Janes on sparkling blue tile, and every seventh measure found oh-so-precise synchronic movements of their anatomical gestures in the big bad beat, no matter how the floor teetered with the bus's motions up the mountain. Archibald felt the mad beat vibrating through the soles of his tasseled loafers. All the Postmodern Heirs looked distinct from one another, each a unique physiognomy, but he couldn't yet tell them apart. Their images formed retinal afterthoughts, his pupils swelling into his blue irises, the most beautiful confusion in the world as he gripped the wall for support. All right, I still haven't figured out what sections to read. My publisher had grave disappointment about my selection, but didn't offer anything else in return. So yeah, that's how it begins. And So the elevator pitch is, this alcoholic lounge singer has to reenact the Epic of Gilgamesh inside a mountain in Tennessee. It really does all that, and it's also good. All right, I think I'll stop there. But thank you so much, everybody.